and hit the record button. All right, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome everybody to Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema, Course 2, Class 5, and we're discussing who I think is one of the most fascinating figures in the traditions of so-called Western esotericism, namely the spirit seer Emanuel Swedenborg. And Swedenborg has a significant influence, particularly on the 19th century occultism and esotericism. And then his popular currency wanes a little bit, and he becomes more of an obscure figure in the 20th century, known more by reputation than by active literary engagement. But because of his significant influence on a number of figures that feed directly into our own tradition, he's kind of a hidden major figure in our own genealogy. And Thelema actually owes quite a bit to Swedenborg in terms of the way that it approaches symbolism, particularly in spiritual experience. And this could be characterized by saying that we derive a certain attitude towards hermeneutics from Swedenborg. And by hermeneutics, I'm using the fancy term for interpretation. And by that, I mean that there's always a particular set of interpretive assumptions and priorities that underlie any reading experience. And when we're encountering symbols or signs or other significant events in our own in a neo-pagan context, that would probably be some kind of magical experience, but there's analogs in other religious or spiritual traditions. How we approach the interpretation of those phenomena, it has a lot to do with the kind of tradition of how the means or method or approach to interpretation that we've inherited from the antecedent genealogy that informs our practice. And Swedenborg is a kind of hidden master, a kind of hidden important figure in that background. And we'll get to exactly what that means and how that leads into the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and their visionary aesthetic and how it's different from Theosophy. The in-depth coverage of that is going to come a little bit later in this course. And right now, I want to front load some information about not just Swedenborg, but the approach to esotericism in the Enlightenment. And we're now past the 17th century, the period of the religious wars, and the period of the dominion of the Habsburgs, the Spanish Imperium. And now that star is on the wane, and France and England are becoming the world powers. And there's other pieces on the board, but Emanuel Swedenborg's dates are 1688 to 1772. He's Swede, obviously, and was a prosperous intellectual in the society of early to mid 1700s Sweden. And what's important about that context is we're now in a period where we have what we could call post-feudal, post-aristocratic conditions. There may still be some nobility about, but basically we're part of a society that's now, it's now a modernity that correlates more with our own experience in terms of the kind of form of urban life and polite society. So this is the era of the middle to upper class gentlemen who make up civil society, and everybody has these upstanding, moral, polite attitudes, what we could call bourgeois virtue or norms. And Swedenborg is very much immersed in that culture. And the difficulty here is that Protestantism has facilitated the emergence of a new liberal bourgeois society that, but its theology is still held over from a kind of medieval feudal experience. And so all the theological categories are rapidly dating. And the Enlightenment period involves a rethinking of traditional theological dogmatics in terms of the conditions for the new experience of subjectivity in modern life that people are experiencing, that is very different than living in a village in the medieval period. And nobody really is having that experience anymore. There are still picks in the sticks, as it were. There is still a rural farm-based economy that people live in, but now those people aren't the society. They're people who are part of a class, that the rural proletariat, that haven't been successfully incorporated into the educational system that now members of the bourgeois ownership class share in common as an intellectual heritage throughout Europe, and then globally as part of the global society under colonialism. So the issue then becomes of getting more people educated in the Enlightenment. And so all these pedagogies have to be worked out to do that. And all the categories of traditional knowledge have to be reassessed. And theology is one of those categories. And it turns, perhaps it's not surprising that it turns out that there's a lot of difficulties involved in this. What's important about Swedenborg and his major contribution to European culture at this point is that he's one of the first people to really fully and completely, on a dogmatic level, rethink all the categories of traditional Christian faith, basically create a new modern version of Christianity, a new religion, based on his writings. And in fact, he himself does not found a church, but there is a so-called new church founded in 1782. Yes, in Britain. And then this spreads rapidly to the American, the newly emerging American states. And so, and then the Swedenborgian denomination and groups or movements or persons influenced by Swedenborg then played an important role in 19th century occultism, right up until Eliphas Levi and Franz Mesmer and company are rethinking again the categories of esotericism. And that will be the subject of the next class in this series. So Swedenborg rethinks Christianity, or rethinks a kind of new modern spirituality that he calls Christianity because that's his culture, but in many ways is radically a new kind of religion. And the way that he's able to get away with this, the way that he's able to do this, is he receives a completely new revelation of heaven and what's going on in heaven. And how this happens is that he starts out having a career as a scientist and intellectual in Sweden, but he's also part of a European-wide, people write in Latin and are able to communicate with anybody else in Europe. And so the intellectual class is a European-wide community. And he was assessor of mines in Sweden. That was his profession from about 1724 to 47. In 1744, he is in his 50s and he has a he has a nervous breakdown, basically. You could call it a midlife crisis. Um, there's been a lot written speculating about the causes and so forth of this, but um, I'm not really going to focus on that. Instead, um, what's important is that in the following year, in 1745, he begins to have visions where he talks to angels. And he says that from that point on, he was constantly in communication with angels. He would just see them just like any other people and talk to them and have conversations all the time. And he was always in heaven and knowing what was going on in heaven. And then um, he begins work on this enormous commentary on the Bible in 1748 called Arcana Coelestia, in which he talks about his ideas with regards to correspondences. We'll get to that subject in a moment. Um, the major work of his that we'll be talking about, which is Heaven and Its Wonders in Hell, or just Heaven and Hell, is published in 1758. And then he prolifically writes in the later part of his life, works on basically dealing with all the dogmatic subjects. He's got um, a book on providence, um, commentary on the book of Revelation, um, lots of other stuff. But we're going to be focusing on his directly visionary material and accounts. And let's just let him explain. He's in some ways um, his best explainer. So let me bring up the text in question. Heaven and Its Wonders in Hell, which he says is drawn from things heard and seen. By the way, the Swedenborg Foundation editions of all of Swedenborg's works are really, really excellent, and I highly recommend them. They're in print and available. All of Swedenborg's major works are easily acquirable, and he's an interesting writer, and I do recommend taking a look at him. And I'll show you what I mean right here. This is the author's preface to Heaven and Hell, which we're going to read. Dan, if you could read um, this first bit, including this passage from the Gospel of Matthew.
Okay, in the 24th chapter of Matthew, we find the Lord talking to his disciples about the close of the age, the last time of the church. At the end of his prophecies concerning the sequence of states of its love and faith, he says, immediately after the suffering of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give us its light. And the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the human-born one will appear in heaven. And then all the tribes of earth will lament. And they will see the human-born one coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a trumpet and a loud voice, and they will gather his chosen ones from the four winds, from one end of the heavens all the way to the other end.
Great,
Matthew.
etc. Taryn, could you read that next paragraph?
When people understand these words according to their literal meaning, they can only believe that all these things are going to happen just as this meaning describes them, at the end of time called the Last Judgment. This does not mean only that the sun and moon will be darkened and that the stars will fall from heaven, that the sign of the Lord will appear in heaven, and that he will be seen in the clouds with angels blowing trumpets. It also includes matters prophesied elsewhere. Statements that the whole visible world is going to be destroyed and that afterward a new heaven and a new earth will come into being.
Okay. Dan, if you could read these two paragraphs here on page 88.
Many people in the church these days are of this opinion. However, people who believe such things are not aware of the hidden depths that lie within the details of the word. There is, in fact, spiritual meaning in these details, for they intend not only the outward and earthly events that we find on the literal level, but spiritual and heavenly events as well. This holds true not just for the meaning of phrases, but even for each word. The word is, in fact, written in pure correspondences, so that there may be deeper meaning in the details. Questions about the nature of this meaning can be resolved by all the things I have set forth about in Secrets of Heaven.
That's Arcana Coelestia, the book I was referring to later, which is this big, enormous Bible commentary where he goes through verse by verse and word through word and tells you what the secret esoteric meaning of this is in terms of his own theology based on this system of correspondences that he's worked out. Okay, keep going.
A selection of these books may be found also in my explanation of the white horse in the book of Revelation. It is in this deeper sense that we are to understand what the Lord said in the passage just cited about coming in the clouds of heaven. The sun that will darken means the Lord in respect to love. The moon means the Lord in respect to faith. The stars mean insights into what is good and true, or into love and faith. The sign of the human-born one in heaven means the appearing of divine truth. The wailing tribes of earth mean all elements of what is true and good, or of faith and love. The Lord's coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory means his presence in the word and revelation. The clouds refer to the literal meaning of the word, and the glory to the word's inner meaning. The angels with a trumpet and a loud voice mean heaven, which is where divine truth comes from.
Okay, great. Let's see. Okay, and then Taryn, if you could read just this last section here to the end of the page.
This enables us to see what these words of the Lord mean. They mean that at the end of the church, when there is no longer any love and therefore no longer any faith, the Lord will open the word by disclosing its deeper meaning and will reveal the heavenly contents hidden within it. The particular hidden contents to be disclosed in the pages that follow have to do with heaven and hell and with our own life after death. Church people these days know practically nothing about heaven and hell or their life after death, even though there are descriptions of everything available to them in the Word. In fact, many who have been born in the church deny all this. In their hearts, they are asking who has ever come back to tell us about it. To prevent this negative attitude, especially prevalent among people who have acquired a great deal of worldly wisdom, from infecting and corrupting people of simple heart and simple faith, it has been granted me to be with angels and to talk with them person to person. I have also been enabled to see what is in heaven and in hell, a process that has been going on for 13 years. Now I am being allowed, therefore, to describe what I have heard and seen in the hopes of shedding light where there is ignorance and dispelling skepticism. The reason this kind of direct revelation is taking place today is that this is what the coming of the Lord means.
And why he says that is because it turns out, according to Swedenborg, that the Last Judgment already occurred. It occurred in the 1700s in heaven, and Swedenborg was there and saw it. And it's an allegory for the founding of the new church by Emanuel Swedenborg's own revelation. And that's the actual meaning of the Last Judgment in the Bible. And so he's been chatting up angels for 13 years about the details of this, and now he's gonna tell us all about it. And there's a few other things in here. I just want to point out on the level of style, perhaps, the bit about people of simple heart and simple faith. This is the basic Lutheran line about, intellectuals, or, these humanists are trying to corrupt simple folk from their simple faith with all this book learning or whatever the narrative is about that. And so even though Swedenborg is, of course, himself an intellectual, he has that kind of rhetoric in the text, and so that's where it comes from. He also seems to think that Jesus wrote the Bible, which is a little bit weird, but okay. Or anyway, it's written from heaven by the Lord, who is Christ. Another thing about Swedenborg that's interesting is he doesn't really believe in the Trinity. He thinks there's one Lord, and it's that Lord or God is a human person who appears as Jesus Christ, and all other human beings are kind of fractals or aspects of that image of what he calls the universal human. So it turns out that God or the divine is the human person. And this is all worked out in his system of correspondences, which are right here. Can everybody see that on the page? Basic correspondences of heaven and hell. So remember, he was talking about love and faith, where these are the
Hang
two.
on, Nathan. We can't see that. We're still just
Okay.
seeing the text.
Let me stop the share and then restart the share. And now it should come up. Okay, great.
Yes.
So here's our basic correspondences. So, and there's more correspondences like this, but he has still this basic bipolarity type of motif that he also works with. And this is a basic theme throughout Swedenborg's writings, is the interaction between love and faith. So you can see some of the things that they are. So, and the idea is that these all emanate from the Lord. And then we receive a kind of spiritual influx from heaven, human beings in the world, which if we can tune into by, trying to be a good and nice person, we can receive divine influx. Swedenborg says it's not difficult to live a heavenly life. And so love is will, faith is understanding, love is feeling, faith is reason, love is the good, wisdom is truth. It's a distinction between justice and judgment. In the human body, these correspond to the heart and the lungs. So in the universal human, the heart of the universal human is love, and the lungs are wisdom or faith. These are the sun and the moon. Female or the wife, or male, the husband, right and left, length and breadth, and so on and so forth. So these correspondences will appear at different points in the text. Now I'm going to switch back to our text. And then, what is heaven for Swedenborg? Okay, well, another thing that's happened is that there's a new type of there's been a revolution in science that's occurred that is another thing that takes us significantly out of the medieval period and into modern times. And the first form of that is something called Cartesianism, and is a type of physics that derives from the philosophy of Rene Descartes. And this postulates that there's the universe is made up of basically two different substances that are created by God. And these are matter and mind. So there's the domain or world of physical extension. And this is completely ontologically, metaphysically distinct and distinguishable from the domain of thought or of mind. And a human person is a conjunction of a mental substance, namely a mind, and a physical substance, namely a body, and that makes up a person. And then at death, the body dies and the mind is separated from the body and is taken into the afterlife by God, who is called infinite substance by Descartes and is kind of the third of a trinity of substances. There's divine substance, mental substance, and physical substance, and these are what make up reality. God is infinite substance, and then you have physical and mental substance. So what Swedenborg has done is he's rethought these Christian dogmatic categories, and he's also in dialogue with certain Neoplatonic ideas. We know his library had a copy of Ficino's translation of Plotinus, for example. So he's in dialogue with the Western esoteric tradition that we've been covering in the previous. He is aware of the existence of these earlier movements and figures, and broadly there are ideas and themes from that occur in his own version of Gnosticism. But part of what makes Swedenborg kind of interesting is that he's what Harold Bloom calls a strong creator, meaning that he's not satisfied with the previous formulations that other people have come up with in the past, that he's read that stuff and he's familiar with it, but he has to rethink everything in terms of his own categories and his own language. Just in a way, create a whole new language, a whole new way of interpreting the world. And this is a whole new system of thought, as it were. And so this makes him extremely creative, but also means that it's sometimes tricky to try to trace the connections between him and the genealogy of ideas that leads up to him, because he's always putting things in his own words and not citing the earlier sources or traditions. Anyway, that's something to point out about Swedenborg that makes him interesting. His physics is Cartesian, and so he's using this mind-body dualism to basically say that the domain of physical extension, that's the world, and then mind, the domain of mind, that's the domain of the spirit, and that's where heaven and hell are. And our souls are part of that world, and so our souls, even while we're in a body, are always already in heaven and hell also, and we receive a spiritual influx from them. And this is because we're always in the domain of the mental. And his example of this is basically the imagination is the space, is the faculty within which all of these spiritual hierophanies, these theological visions occur. But let me again let Swedenborg explain himself to us. Dan, if you could read here where he starts, where I have the cursor, where he talks about the natural world.
By the natural world, I mean all that extended reality that is under our sun, and that receives its light and warmth from it.
Notice he says extended reality. That's res extensia from Descartes, who says that the essence of physical substance is that it has the category of extension. Okay, keep going.
All the things that are sustained in being from that source belong to that world, the spiritual world. In contrast is heaven, and to that world belong all the things that are in the heavens.
Okay, so the spiritual world is then the domain of mental substance, the other part of the two domains of existence for Descartes. Okay, keep going and read through. You see how it's in the margin, it says the number 90. The text is subdivided into these sections. So if you could just read to the end of 90.
Okay. Since a human being is a heaven and a world in least form in the image of the greatest, there is a spiritual world and a natural world within each of us. The deeper elements, which belong to our minds and relate to our intelligence and volition, constitute our spiritual world, while the outer elements, which belong to our bodies and relate to our senses and actions, constitute our natural world. Anything that occurs in our natural world, that is, in our bodies and in their senses and actions, because of our spiritual world, that is, because of our minds and their intelligence and volition, is called something that corresponds.
Correspondence. Okay, here we go. Because there's a correspondence between the natural world and the spiritual world. And the language of those correspondences is derived by Swedenborg from scripture. So this gives him the key, as it were, to interpret what all the different correspondences are. So in a way, we're kind of extending the way this worked, say, in alchemy and also in Jacob Boehme, where you recall that in Jacob Boehme, who we talked about last week, he has this idea of the signatures of all things. This is an idea that comes from alchemy, but also ultimately also from Ficino's natural magic. And that's the idea that there are these astrological influences that are sidereally infused into the substance of everything that's in the universe in virtue of this thing that's called the world soul. Because remember, for Ficino and the Platonists, the cosmos is a living being and has a soul. And for Jacob Boehme, that cosmic soul was the third divine principle, was the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity. And so in virtue of that, the very substance of the world is living and divine. Now, Swedenborg doesn't think that's the case, because Cartesianism has killed the living universe. And Descartes and his followers, and throughout this period of modernity, conceive of the universe in dead mechanistic terms. And so material substance is always reducible to smaller components that in themselves don't really have life or volition or meaning or purpose. And they have to receive this from their relationship to the mental domain of existence. That's why he says that because of the connection of the natural world to the spiritual world through the human person being a unity of these two, in virtue of that, the natural world can be said to be something that corresponds, but not because it's that way necessarily innately in terms of its structuring qua its materiality. And that is something that's the Cartesian physics kills the world soul, and it creates a kind of very grim, deterministic type of materialism that becomes dominant in becomes philosophically dominant, and is basic to the way physics works really until the Einsteinian revolution in physics in the early 20th century. And then, of course, the working out by Schrodinger, Bohr, and so forth of quantum mechanics, which exploded the deterministic view of the world, which Einstein was in fact a bit upset about, because he still had a kind of aesthetic allegiance to the comfortable determinism, reductive materialism of the older Newtonian physics, which he of course had displaced with his own theory, but he still wanted to hold on to the certain bits of it. And so he was concerned that it had turned out that the theory seemed to be prevailing, that the universe was probabilistic at a quantum level and not deterministic. And that's the kind of current paradigm in physics, called in its most originally worked out form. It's called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, although there are other versions and also criticisms of it. There's also something called superdeterminism, which is, again, an attempt to reintroduce a kind of Newtonian or Cartesian determinism into physics. It's not the dominant position in physics right now, although there are prominent people who are doing work and trying to see if they can prove or do work in that paradigm. Anyway, so what that means for Swedenborg, though, is that the the spiritual domain becomes inside of human beings, and becomes this kind of imaginative dreamscape, this mental virtual reality that basically he's able to daydream himself into at any time. And this is the place where you can recover, the spiritual meaning of your life. In a way, basically what I'm saying is that, among other figures, Swedenborg is creating a kind of modern psychology. And anyway, let's talk about heaven. Okay. Here at the beginning of 94, he says, it's already been explained that heaven in its totality reflects a single person, and that it is a person in image and is therefore called the universal human. Let's see. Okay, let's not worry about that. And instead, let's talk about what heaven's like. So heaven is in the shape of a human person. And all the different parts of heaven correspond to different organs within the human person. So, but it only appears as a human person by correspondence. So if you're actually in heaven, it looks just like the earth. So there's people there, and they live in cities, and they have families, and they go to church, and they have day-to-day activities, and it looks just like, and they eat and they drink and they do all the things just as if they're on the earth, except with the difference that the inner and the outer are united in heaven, whereas they're separate on the earth. So that intention always is equivalent to action, and there's not a division between the two. In other words, in heaven, you become who you are, not in potential, but in actuality. And this is determined by how you lived your life. And then when you arrive in heaven, you're grouped into little communities, little towns, just based on your affinities to other people. And this is an idea that Swedenborg has, that the true self is defined by what he calls your dominant love, your amor regnans, in which there's this union between inner and outer, or between your intention is equivalent to your action. Faith and works correlate, the great Lutheran ideal, so that they're not separate from each other, and that the works are grounded in the faith and not the other way around. Now, what I find interesting about this idea of the dominant love that the different communities are grouped in, and kind of find each other through affinity, so that each community has a different function, or a different use function, and therefore has the correspondences all relate to different use functions for Swedenborg. So each of the communities will be related to a particular organ in the body, which then also has a correlation in the universal human, because each organ in the body has an organic function in relation to you see how this metaphor works on these kind of repeating levels. So there's marriage love in heaven. Swedenborg kind of famous for this. We don't have too much time to go into it. And okay, so I mentioned there's the Lord appears in heaven as a sun, and he says that it's at a 45-degree angle, and then there's a moon that's offset at another angle from the sun. And because the Lord is always present in heaven, if you're in heaven, whichever direction you turn and face, the sun will move, and you'll find that you're facing it. So that the Lord is always, you're always faced towards the Lord in heaven. And then there's different internal divisions in heaven, which correspond to the head or the chest or the trunk. And these are based on what state that you're in heaven. And you can go up and down in state and become closer to or further from the Lord. And then things get really interesting, because there's also a hell, which is the opposite of heaven. Oh yes, one more thing about heaven. It's different for everybody. Let me actually read you this passage. This is paragraph 405. Swedenborg writes, almost all the people who arrive in the other life think that hell is the same for everyone and that heaven is the same for everyone, when in fact there are infinite variations and differences in each. Hell is never the same for any two people, nor is heaven. In the same way, no one of us, no spirit and no angel is ever exactly like any other, even facially. When I even thought about two identical or equal beings, the angels were aghast. They said that every unity is formed by a harmonious agreement of many constituents, that the nature of the unity depends on the nature of the agreement. This is how every community of heaven forms a unity, and how all the communities form a single heaven, which is accomplished solely by the Lord by means of love, etc. So this means that in a lot of ways, Swedenborg's heaven is similar to what the Theosophists called the astral plane, the place where you project your consciousness, where you have visions, the subtle planes of reality in the Theosophical system. And then, of course, we can recognize that this is very similar to the way that basically similar to the way that the astral plane works in the Golden Dawn and in Thelemic magic as well, in the sense that it's different for everybody. So you're not necessarily having the same vision as anybody else who's on it, but there is a commonality because there's a common language of correspondences in terms of which practitioners within the same tradition are able to interpret the symbolic meaning of the astral visions that they're having. And so that's why you have that list of correspondences in 777 that are based on the correspondences that were in the Golden Dawn. And these work basically analogously to the way that Swedenborg's correspondences work, which is that when you're in heaven, when you see things, they all have the figurative meaning. And so you're not necessarily supposed to interpret them literally. So for example, if you're in heaven and you see an angel, the angel tells you that there's going to be, great destruction in the earth in, I don't know, Venice or whatever. And the stars will fall from the heaven or whatever. There'll be great beasts that shall devour each other. The beasts symbolize the passions. And the apocalypse symbolizes that there's going to be a revolution towards faith in the life of the people there. And so it's all a metaphor for spiritual or cultural factors. And of course, potentially this can all be politicized, even if it's not directly the case in Swedenborg, although obviously he's representing heaven as a kind of um, idyllic bourgeois utopia. This is the ultimate projection of a kind of if the entire whole of reality were just endless little polite suburbs that you can wander between and have pleasant conversations with your fellow gentlemen citizens. You know, talk about how live in the faith and love of the true Christian community, as Swedenborg imagines it. And of course, implicitly, this is all supposed to be a model for how the church is supposed, as Swedenborg envisions it, is supposed to behave on the earth. This is how the enlightened community of faith is supposed to. And so he's trying to establish a kind of correspondence between things that he's seen and heard in heaven, and hopefully now there'll be this apocalypse, and people will be brought to faith as he's espoused it. And it's this amazing creative project, and becomes very influential in the larger Enlightenment. Although most people reject Swedenborg's exegesis and his fantastical account of how he came up with all of this. There's a lot of people in the Enlightenment who are very interested in the theology and the theological revolution that Swedenborg represents. And one of the most important of those is, of course, Emanuel Kant, who is early on, he's a critic of Swedenborg. In 1766, he wrote a book called Dreams of a Spirit Seer, in which he expresses skepticism towards the type of access to truth that visionaries like Swedenborg are alleging, because Kant is in line with another aspect of the Lutheran tradition, which is the criticism of everything that smacks of there's this German word, Schwärmerei. What that means is it's an enthusiast, it refers to religious enthusiasm. This is something that if you're an upstanding Lutheran gentleman, you're not supposed to be into that. That smacks of heresy, and you should be very sober in your you can be enthusiastic, but you should be sober in your piety. And this is part of the bourgeois kind of politeness norms. And so Kant is kind of appalled at the spectacular audaciousness of Swedenborg's claims to revelation. But he's also influenced by Swedenborg's theology. And in fact, in 1793, Kant comes out with his own Enlightenment theology, which is a work entitled Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. And in many ways, the kind of anti-institutional, individualistic type of faith that Kant is espousing in this book, which really doesn't have anything to do with the faith in the historical Jesus. It's a kind of secularized vision of a kind of Christian faith identity as something that can now be just a kind of secular, individualistic morality, public morality. And this basically comes from the type of secular, not for Swedenborg, secularized, of course, but the type of individualized morality or ethics that Swedenborg is setting out in his own theology. So there's a lot of controversy, but also been a lot of interesting scholarly work done on a kind of covert influence on Kant's thought and on Enlightenment thought in general. It's become common, particularly in the last 20 years of scholarship, to talk about a kind of Swedenborgian underground in the Enlightenment of people who are reading and influenced by Swedenborg, and how far that kind of spreads into what later gets taken to be under a more rationalistic categorization of the Enlightenment of the what I'm trying to say is that the Enlightenment is a contested category. And in a way, the Enlightenment itself is a contesting of traditional knowledge. And by the time you get to the high bourgeois culture of the late 19th, early 20th century, the Bertrand Russell narrative of the Enlightenment, the John Stuart Mill version of the Enlightenment, that these intellectuals see themselves as legitimately as the inheritors of. But they've also back interpreted what the Enlightenment was in terms of scientific and rationalistic categories. And the actual historical Enlightenment is really much more messy and complicated than that. But because of the dominance of this kind of secular notion of the Enlightenment, particularly in the 1990s, there was this idea of what was called a counter-Enlightenment. And figures like Swedenborg were grouped in this thing that was called the counter-Enlightenment. And that represented a kind of occult or esoteric parallel to the Enlightenment, but that was rejecting the values of rationalism and clarity of the more mainstream scientific Enlightenment. And I think a lot of the scholarship in the last 20 years or so has shown that this is really a false dichotomy, and that particularly the work of, say, Jonathan Israel or other or more recent scholars of the Enlightenment, that they've shown that the counter-Enlightenment really is. Francis Yates is also kind of an earlier scholar to kind of stumble on this truth, which is that the counter-Enlightenment is the Enlightenment. This isn't a real distinction. I think Swedenborg provides us an example that we can see how this is the case, that he's both part of the scientific and rationalist Enlightenment, at the same time with no contradiction from his standpoint. He's also fully immersed in what we can represent as a fully occult or esoteric type of Enlightenment as well. And we'll also see when we get to Eliphas Levi next week exactly how he also embodies this non-dichotomy between an occult and a rational and scientific Enlightenment. In fact, many early scientists are very much interested in alchemy. Newton, of course, is an example of this. Boyle practiced alchemy, and so forth and so on. In fact, we really need to speak of many different kinds of enlightenment. So Jonathan Israel talks about a radical enlightenment that's associated with the emergence of democracy in modernity. Jocelyn Godwin talks about a theosophical enlightenment that's occurring during this period. And then, of course, Frances Yates talks about what she calls a Rosicrucian enlightenment that she sees as occurring a little bit earlier, more at the beginning of the 1600s, but inheriting this kind of earlier phase of occult scientific speculation and thought, with figures like Cornelius Agrippa or Robert Flood being part of that narrative that then feeds into the alchemical stuff, that's writings, Michael Meyer and so forth, that's going on, texts like the Splendor Solis, and also the Rosicrucian manifestos that we talked about a few classes back. Anyway, there's a whole lot more that we can talk about with Swedenborg, and maybe I will say some more about him, but we're coming up on the 3 o'clock, and I want to open to some questions or comments, and maybe we could see where we want to take the conversation about Swedenborg. So Dan or Taryn, did you have anything you wanted to jump in at this point and contribute to the conversation? Some of your own reflections or thoughts, questions you might have.
So when he's talking about the divine, the Godhead basically being in a physical form, is he kind of intimating that we each will come to that, or that it really is something outside of ourselves? Like,
yes, he's basically, there's an interfusion of the human and the divine on every level of reality for Swedenborg. They're the same thing. And it's like a kind of emanation, like in Platonism, where as it permutates itself, you get this kind of fractal effect. But the idea is that heaven is where it all comes back into a kind of organic hierarchical unity. And here he is hearkening back to the Platonic ideal of esotericism in the past. But there is a kind of point where this gets disrupted for him, and that's with hell. And this is kind of where things get interesting. So let me say something. Let me say something about that. There's a kind of dialectic between heaven and hell, where Swedenborg writes, this is a quote, and this is from, I think, paragraph 536 in 7, if you want to look that up in the book. He says, heaven and hell, quote, act against each other, unquote. In other words, they create an equilibrium through opposition. So everything just isn't, this harmonious, bourgeois social club in heaven, where everybody who has the same hobbies live together and do stuff in common. There's this radical alterity that is also a kind of negativity within this larger system that's outside of heaven and yet still has a relationship with it, because there's an equilibrium that's created by what Swedenborg calls the spiritual balance, that is caused by the fact that he's dedicated to the idea of human freedom. Okay, so Swedenborg is part of a Lutheran society, but like many, there's a kind of common theme that runs through Protestant esotericism, which is the rejection of predestination, the rejection, because it's too much like Calvinism. It's the part of Luther that Lutherans don't like, is his denial of the freedom of the will, his insistence of the bondage of the will. And so there's a long history of Protestant, often Lutheran intellectuals, often esoteric occultists, who come out of a Protestant and Lutheran context, but their esotericism is an advocacy of free will. So that was the case with Burma. It's also the case with Swedenborg. So the divine being human is also the freedom of the human, which is divine, in that very freedom which is divine, to reject the divine at the same time. So he has to include this negative moment to be able to uphold freedom. So the idea here is that the Lord actively keeps human beings in this balance, and therefore does not take away the evil from us in the sense of us being able to choose it. So it's not until you die that this gets sorted out and who goes to heaven or hell, because you arrive in this intermediary realm that Swedenborg calls the world of spirits. And there's these two, it's in this big valley, and there's these two gates, and one goes to heaven and one goes to hell. And based on how you lived your life, your affinity towards heaven or hell is then you make up your mind at that point, and you go through one gate or the other. Every community in heaven has an opposite evil community in hell. And Swedenborg writes, quote, nothing exists without a relationship to its opposite. The opposite enables us to know its actual nature and level. Opposition is the source of all perception and sensation, unquote. And I think this is that kind of a hidden radical dialectic that's in Swedenborg. It was more explicit in Burma about his ideal of the Godhead that was disunited with itself within itself. And this ultimate equilibrium of the negative that's balanced out with the positive is then the very basis for human or angelic freedom. And by the way, all the devils and angels that are in heaven and hell are just human beings who died and went to heaven and hell. There's no separate creation of angels. Angels are human beings, and human beings are angels. And human beings are devils, and devils are human beings. There's actually no difference. It's just the postmortem state of the soul, or I should say the human person, because it's always united with some body, whether that's an imaginative visionary body, which Swedenborg calls an appearance that's in heaven, or whether it's the physical body that you're united with. So the soul is never without a body. It always because the human person is a unity of inner and outer, of intention and action, whenever it manifests, because that's the form of the divine. But then, of course, this implies that the human and divine are the same, and then this odd anti-Trinitarian aspect of Swedenborg also comes into play, where it's like the true divine person is the Son, is Christ, is Jesus, who's the divine in human form. There is no separate Holy Spirit. There is no separate God the Father. And that being that is human is the infinity, but that's an infinite extension of heaven, which goes on forever and is always being filled by more. See, because there's also human beings on other planets, because this is also the Copernican universe, where there's those stars you see up in the heavens. Those are other solar systems with other planets where there's other human beings, and they're also angels, and they also go to heaven. So heaven is always being infinitely filled by infinite beings on infinite planets, so that it's always growing infinitely fast towards being more and more infinitely big. And then that's eternity. And there's no eternity that's separate from that, you see, because it always has to be embodied and real at the same time, whether that's in this utopian virtual form, or the world which Swedenborg says is the seed bed of eternity, the seed bed of heaven. When the plant grows, that apple drops, and then it drops into heaven, I guess, or whatever. That's the metaphor. Now, William Blake will say that opposition is true friendship. And this is the more radical romantic, although view of this sort of role of the negative. And it reaches its apogee perhaps in Hegel's dialectic, but it's anticipated again already in Burma as this sort of radical idea. And that's the idea that unlike in Swedenborg, where there is a negative to heaven, or to the absolute, but it is in a way still outside of the absolute and balancing it. So there's still this organic hierarchical order of being that still Swedenborg wants to hold on to, that's still from this medieval Platonic spirituality. But in the more radical modern version of this, in a way, this sort of deeper insight is that the negative isn't outside of the absolute. The negative is within the absolute. In fact, the absolute is the negative. And that is the idea that it's ultimately finds its expression in the idea of the Kabbalistic zero in Thelema and in the Book of the Law and in Aleister Crowley's philosophy. So, and again, part of my purpose in doing these courses is to sort of trace out the trajectory of that in modern thought and show how Thelema is the end product of a conversation that's going on all the way back to Pythagoras, and not just some new idea that kind of just pops out of nowhere. And I mean, we know that already, but I want to show the work on the board, as it were, so we can see that how that actually works out with these individual figures. And of course, the great reader of Swedenborg is William Blake, who started his life out as being interested in Swedenborgianism, but then that led him into his own spirituality. And of course, for Blake, the human imagination is itself the divine. And as he says in the marriage of heaven and hell, he says, man has no body distinct from his soul, for that called body is a portion of soul discerned by the five senses, the chief inlets of soul in this age. And he says, energy is the only life, and it is from the body, and reason is the bound or outward circumference of energy. And he says, energy is eternal delight. And he says that energy is from the body, it is of the body. All right. And so this is sort of what he's getting from Swedenborg. And he even gets this idea. He says that God will torment man in eternity for following his energies, which are the origin, because energy is the source both of evil and good. that energy called evil is alone from the body, and that reason called good is alone from the soul. So you see how this is Swedenborgian, or at least derives from these categories. But Blake is playing with them in this very creative way and goes further, just as Romanticism will go further than the Enlightenment. And of course, we'll be looking at that more in the next segment. Okay. Any further questions, comments? Taryn, did you have anything you wanted to say or add, or we might want to talk about?
I'm just curious how you see, kind of like what you were talking about of we're tracing the line, through to Crowley, and I'm particularly struck by perhaps Swedenborg's influence on Crowley's idea of the Christos and this idea of like Christ consciousness, the Christ genius in particular. And I'm curious to know your thoughts on like, how is that direct, or is it more indirect? Does it take another step before it gets there?
Would you believe it's actually very direct? And the intermediary figure is Anna Kingsford. And Anna Kingsford, who founded a group with Edward Maitland called the Hermetic Society. And the story goes is that Madame Blavatsky shows up in London to start out the lodge of the Theosophical Society that was there. And Anna Kingsford was early on a prodigy at the London chapter of the Theosophical Society, but then she came into conflict with Blavatsky and wound up splitting off and founding her own group called the Hermetic Society. And basically, the difference that Kingsford had with Blavatsky is that Anna Kingsford had started out as a Swedenborgian, and she thought that Blavatsky's interpretation of astral phenomena were too literal and therefore reductive, and therefore too much bound up in the scientific materialist paradigm that Theosophy was trying to break with and make. In other words, what Blavatsky had done is she had substituted one positivism for another. She'd substituted the naturalistic positivism for an occult, what she called occult science, which was just as kind of pseudo-scientifically dogmatic. And Kingsford thought that the difficulty had been that Blavatsky had not interpreted her visions metaphorically, based on spiritual correspondences, a doctrine that she got from Swedenborg, but of course it's linked to the older alchemical and Platonic tradition and Fichtean physics. So Anna Kingsford wrote a book called The Perfect Way, in which she presents her own interpretation of occult and hermetic doctrine in terms of various symbolic correspondences. Many of the ideas come directly from Swedenborg, but she's added her own revelations on top of that. She, of course, also converses with angels and has conversations and so forth, and is able to do this. One of the more important members of the Hermetic Society was MacGregor Mathers, and he learned Kabbalah from Anna Kingsford, because in addition to this, another thing that she was trying to bring into the conversation with Theosophy was the Kabbalah, that she had also studied. So Mathers learns two things from the Hermetic Society that then feed directly into the Golden Dawn, which then feed directly into Crowley, which are the interpretation of astral visions in terms of symbolic correspondences that derives from Swedenborg by way, and the Swedenborgian tradition, by way of Anna Kingsford's Hermetic Society. And then the other idea he gets from Anna Kingsford is in this book, The Perfect Way. She said that the goal of occultism and of practical occultism should be to achieve communion with what she called the Lord or Adonai, which she interprets in terms of the higher and divine genius of the Iamblican Neoplatonic tradition that you're trying to theurgically get in communication with. Oh, says Mathers, that means that the Rosicrucianism should be interpreted where Jesus stands for the holy guardian angel or higher and divine self or genius. And then the goal of second order theurgic practice is to get into communication with this. And I found this other text at the Arsenal Library in Paris, the Abramelin text, that also talks about this procedure. Okay, this is now the focus of magical practice in the second order. Okay, well then Crowley takes that and runs with it. But that derives also from this book by Anna Kingsford, The Perfect Way, where the ideal is that you're coming into communication with your higher genius, which she calls Adonai or the Lord, and is, again, perhaps related to this communion with the Lord in heaven in Swedenborg as well. And so it turns out that the lineage, rather than being indirect from Swedenborg in terms of these, of course, these other ideas, it turns out that there's actually this kind of direct lineage that comes from Anna Kingsford, who I think is a major figure in Victorian occultism, particularly in England, who is significantly forgotten now. She's also represents some female leadership, which is, interesting and important as well to try to recover. I think it's worthwhile pausing to take a look at her stuff and bring her back into the conversation. But the moment you do that, you discover the particularly and distinctively Swedenborgian character of her writings. And then you realize there's this kind of back door, perhaps not of the symbolism in the way that it's interpreted directly, but the hermeneutics, the methodology of interpreting visions in terms of a symbolic set of correspondences. It turns out there's actually this really direct line that's running from Crowley back to Swedenborg, but it's been concealed because the intermediary figure is Anna Kingsford that people kind of forgotten about. And you pick up the narrative with the Theosophical Society, and then it's Westcott and Mathers, and they're founding that in competition with the Theosophical Society, so that the Inner Order of the Golden Dawn can teach practical occultism in competition with the esoteric section of the Golden Dawn, the Theosophical Society, which was being advertised as giving you practical occultism, but then it turns out maybe it was another bait and switch. That's a larger conversation. But anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, Taryn, or if you want to comment on that.
No, absolutely, that's so fascinating. And yeah, the forgotten figures are the most interesting. I think
that's right. She died young because medical technology not being what it was, and people do that regardless of the level of medical technology. But anyway, Edward Maitland kind of carried on, and then Thelemites tend to ignore Anna Kingsford because Crowley kind of snubs her by mentioning Edward Maitland instead, and saying that Anna Kingsford was but the mouthpiece for Edward Maitland, which is sort of just him being kind of snide. And then he kind of castigates and is down on Edward Maitland, and because they're competitors, and so he wants to differentiate his own brand. And so, but it's this important part of the conversation. I remember how excited I was when I was finally able to locate a copy of The Perfect Way at the GTU library. I had to request it out of special storage, but they had a copy, and it's like totally out of print, but I was able to get a photocopy of it. And I think it might be worth some further study at some point, although it's beyond the limits of this particular class. But again, it's this hidden influence of particularly the Swedenborgian tradition, which really is one of the major traditions in the 19th century. But then, as bourgeois scientific rationalism becomes more dominant in culture, the occult enlightenment, or the occult aspect of the enlightenment, becomes a kind of lost or suppressed knowledge, to use Wouter Hanegraaff's category, and has to be kind of subsequently rehabilitated. So what's so fascinating about the history of Western esotericism is that it's filled with these hidden genealogies. And what's so fun is that you start turning the spade up and you don't even have to dig deep. It's like the moment you start turning the spade up, you start uncovering all of these connections between all these figures who really are historically in conversation with each other on a very deep and profound level. And then suddenly you discover that you're able to become part of that conversation as well. And then Thelema becomes not just this kind of curiosity, but or interesting just in its own right, but important and interesting because it's connected to this really intense historical conversation that's been going on and on. Frederick Jameson talks about how postmodernism, postmodern culture involves a kind of erasure of history and of historical memory. And it's instead replaced by commodity culture, by a kind of media culture that has to reinvent itself in every new market cycle. And these market cycles become quicker and quicker until with, internet media, we've got stuff sometimes trending on an hour by hour basis as the attention span that we have. Theodore Adorno talks about the retention of listening, that our attention span or our consumer consumption of media becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and quicker and quicker and quicker, and more of these little sound bites. And that's why it's so important to fight back against the alienation that produces, the reification of culture and the limiting of our cultural potential as human beings, to get back in touch with this broader historical memory. And esotericism, perhaps unexpectedly, the study of it becomes itself its own historical adventure as you find this bigger and big, your worldview kind of starts expanding. You discover all these connections to this larger historical narrative. And of course, Aleister Crowley himself is part of this late 19th century, early 20th century, very highly educated bourgeois culture that we've lost in our postmodern media culture and in the education that we receive, where all this information is still available to us, perhaps even available to a even greater extent than anyone else in history. But we have to self-consciously seek it out by turning off our phone and turning off the television and actually sitting down and doing some historical research. Heaven forbid. What's that? But it's something you wouldn't just do as part of a college class, that you would actually you would do as part of your genuine intellectual interest, as part of your ongoing adult education. And that maybe somehow we can recover some aspect of that great John Dewey democratic ideal of the self-educated American citizen scholar who, pardon to anybody who's watching this video is an American, but where we're able to recover some of that lost thickness to our potential cultural experience. And of course, that can help us inform our true will as magicians. And so that's why I think it's interesting and also fun to read some of these earlier figures where I love the weirdness of Swedenborg. I love the preposterous quality of the type of claims that he's making. There's a kind of bourgeois arrogance to that, and yet it's wonderful when somebody is just willing to just go for it. And it's fun to read. It's fun to read somebody who is willing to kind of take their ideas to the end and give us some substance. Maybe there's a kind of craziness to that. Maybe the whole secret of Swedenborg is that in 1744, he goes crazy and thinks he's talking to angels and writes these crazy books. And yet they're fascinating books. They've got some interesting ideas that turn out to be really at the tap root of what we're trying to trying to do still as magicians. Um, and again, because his modernity is the same as ours in a way, I mean, there are differences, but he's talking about the same bourgeois individuality that's our subjectivity. And so he's able to speak to us in that way. Um, Dan, did you have any other questions or things we want to talk about? We've got about 10 minutes left. Wanted to make sure I covered everything that people want to talk about.
No, it's great what you've said so far. It's a very good class. Thank you.
Okay, great. So let's see. Let me just take a look here and see if there's anything else I wanted to talk about. A little bit more about Immanuel Kant. Part of the reason he's probably writing, part of the impetus to write the Critique of Pure Reason probably comes from Swedenborg. There's a number of factors that come into play. There's basically three major things that occur, I think, in terms of influence on what Kant calls the awakening from his dogmatic slumber, where he started out as a Leibnizian metaphysician in the Christian Wolff tradition, major figure in German philosophy at the time, not so well known in Anglo-American philosophy. People know Leibniz, but not so much Christian Wolff. But Kant read David Hume, whose skepticism made him realize that the type of metaphysics that was still being practiced by the Leibnizian tradition was not sustainable philosophically. Second, he read a novel by Jean-Jacques Rousseau called Emile, or Emily, I guess would be the English way of pronouncing the name, which is about the education of a girl. And Rousseau, I think it's also the education of the young woman's brother as well. Anyway, Rousseau uses this narrative to talk about all of his educational ideas. And Kant stayed up all night reading this novel because it so excited him. And this kind of awakened him to the Enlightenment ideal of autonomy as a kind of self-education ideal. And it comes from Rousseau, the education of the sentiments. And then Kant takes it in the direction of developing this theme of what he calls autonomy or human freedom as the basis for his philosophy, which is then going to be probably along with the idea of the Gefühl, the feeling or sentiment or emotional intuition. Kantian autonomy is going to be one of the other main ideals that is important in German idealism and German Romanticism also generally. Okay, and then the third thing that awakened Kant from his dogmatic slumber was Swedenborg, and particularly the Enlightenment theology that Swedenborg does, where Swedenborg is able to rethink all these Christian dogmatic categories in terms of a moral ideal for an autonomous, free human person in modern society. And that's the Enlightenment ideal that is also Kant's. But he doesn't like he wants to be able to derive this ideal from a kind of secularized, pure and practical reason that doesn't have to have any recourse to religious faith or belief for Kant. Kant thinks that you should not have morality be out of appeal to a dogmatic religious faith that's imposed upon you by a confessional obedience. It should be something that you feel in your heart. Again, that's the Lutheran ideal. You're supposed to feel your faith in your heart. But it's something that you should be able to derive through your own authentic, autonomous, free, ethical duty to virtue. that you should be able to arrive at through a rational process, not through appeal to metaphysics. So the basic argument of the Critique of Pure Reason, the first of Kant's major philosophical works of his mature period, the whole point of the book is to basically say that it's an illegal move for someone like Swedenborg to come along and say that they can have direct knowledge and experience of what Kant calls the noumenal realm in distinction from the phenomenal realm. And Kant says we can't know how things are in themselves. We can't directly know heaven or God. We can only posit those things in faith. What we can know relates to the phenomenal world of appearances, which is the bounds of sense, which is the limit of our experience. And this is bounded by certain categorical categories: space, time, causality. There's certain other formal categories. And then there's also then this practical reason that we can get access to ethics. And then in the domain of this third category called judgment, there's this thing called aesthetics, works of art, and the experience of the sublime, and also teleology that might intimate the possibility of immortality of the soul. But again, that's something that's postulated through a practical reason, but not known through pure reason a priori, or known without there being a doubt. A type of knowledge that would be immune to skepticism. And this is basically to try to outlaw these Schwärmerei, these religious enthusiasts like Swedenborg, who come along and say they know what the truth is. And Kant is part of the Enlightenment tradition that is suspicious of that because it feels it leads to the kind of dogmatic conflict that led to the religious wars of the 1600s. And so from the point of view of a kind of liberal humanistic desire to be opposed to religious fanaticism, Kant sets up the argument the way that he does in the Critique of Pure Reasons. But he's motivated to do that in part by being a reader and a kind of covert enthusiast also in a way of Swedenborg, because he's very enthusiastic about his theology, which he basically agrees with. He's just not enthusiastic. He's scandalized by Sweden's visions. And the solution to this is, I think, in Romanticism, where there's a development of the theory of the imagination as a place where you can have aesthetic epiphanies that don't need to be metaphysically justified, but can be metaphors or allegories also. They can be symbols of some deeper numinous esoteric or existential ground of being that doesn't need to be thematized in traditional metaphysical hierarchical organic terms. And this solution in a way is already in Swedenborg, because in the form of his doctrine of the correspondences, and his ideal that heaven can be seen differently by everybody. And that opens the door for William Blake and a lot of other interesting things to come along. Okay, we're coming up on 3:30. Any last comments or questions, Taryn or Dan? Taryn, if you want to close this out, any last comments or remarks?
No, I'm fine. Thanks, Nathan. Great class.
Okay, great. We're going to look at Eliphas Levi next week, and we were looking at the 18th century this class, and next class we're basically going to look at the 19th century. And so just as Swedenborg is a kind of way to consolidate 18th century occultism or esotericism in one figure, a little bit unfairly, but also he's a major figure, so this is a way to kind of do the Cliff's Notes version. For 19th century occultism, we're going to look at Eliphas Levi as the person where all these kind of themes or motifs of his era come together in this major literary figure, and his great, sometimes very uneven, but very fascinating masterpiece, the Doctrine of Ritual Transcendental Magic, which we're going to have a nice reading of next week. So thanks everybody for coming. Love is the law, love under will. This has been our class.